My presentation today, which is based on my agenda for further research, will be structured as follows. I will introduce my topic allocated within the guiding questions of the workshop. I will then justify my approach and explain what my arguments are. To conclude with insights that might support us to achieve one of the objectives of this workshop in terms of exploring diverse cultural, philosophical, and cultural understandings in terms of climate reparations, which will need to be adapted to the Australian context, as my discussion it's mostly from a global perspective today. My presentation today engages with the following workshop questions. What actors have climate reparation obligations? Are fossil fuel companies better positioned to be the objects of reparative demands? And how should private climate reparations responsibilities be differently conceptualized? Specifically, the objectives of my presentation are to explore the responsibilities fossil fuel companies have in the context of climate reparations, using the notion of ecological debt as a counter-hegemonic agenda to define these responsibilities, and to add to the arguments of my fellow panelists to strengthen climate justice proposals, aiming at assigning responsibilities to the fossil fuel industry, in particular, to finance socio-ecological transitions for developing countries. That is one of my primary research interests currently. Let me start with the problem. Well, we're currently missing mechanisms to demand acknowledgement and to compensate for the civilizational and planetary crisis, of which climate change is just one symptom, that certain actors, in particular fossil corporations, have disproportionately cost. Even though advances in climate attribution science already allow to clearly establish causal links between the activities of certain sectors and actors and climate change, my argument today is not based on science, but on a historical, decolonial informed approach to define these responsibilities and support demands for climate justice. This approach is the notion of the ecological debt. Ecological debt is an umbrella term that encompasses interdependent and plural debts accrued by the development models of industrialized countries since colonial times. Ecological debt was popularized due to its implementation in the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which was advanced by various civil society organizations to abolish the illegitimate foreign debts of 35 of the world's poorest countries. Ecological debt was also pivotal in Ecuadorian environmental diplomacy initiatives. In 2007, my country, I am Ecuadorian, pioneered the acknowledgement of nations of the Global South as ecological creditors, and this was included in our National Development Plan for 2007 to 2010. This proposal was followed by a compensation proposal, the Yasuni ITT initiative. The Ecuadorian government claimed that global ecological debtors have the historical responsibility to pay an economic compensation for the avoided emissions resulting from the country's will to leave our oil reserves untouched in the Yasuni ITT block, which is located in a biosphere reserve in the Amazon. This compensation aimed at financing the country's renewable energy transition and other sustainability agendas, in line with endogenous development strategies. However, the initiative was not successful as a compensation strategy, and it was banned. Great ideas always, not always get traction. A second proposal founded on the notion of ecological debt and the principle of shared but differentiated responsibilities to avoid, not just to offset emissions, was presented at the COP16 in 2010 by Ecuador's ex-president Rafael Correa. This was the Net Avoid Emissions Mechanism, NE for its Spanish acronyms, that aim at guaranteeing developing countries are fairly compensated for doing more than their fair share to avoid emissions. A more contemporary usage of ecological debt, however, is as an analytical framework to unveil the inequalities that are reproduced in North-South relationships, highlighting the cost of economic growth of the North has been paid through ecological degradation and sacrifice of the populations of the South. This is understood as an ecological subsidy, which is encompassed in the spoliation of the natural resources of the Global South, unequal ecological exchange, and the devastation of myriad cultures and plural ways of life. Ecological debt, rather than a tool to quantify these subsidies, offers a lens to, first, define historical socio-ecological injustice. Second, to identify those responsible for the current civilizational and ecological crisis. And, as I will argue in this presentation, to support climate justice proposals suggesting corporations, in particular the fossil fuel industry, have a role to play in funding sustainability transitions. Why the fossil fuel industry? Well, while tracing responsibility of industrialized nation states in accelerating the Anthropocene through the appropriation of more than their fair share of the global commons to sustain their fossil fuel-driven economies is challenging, it is, however, possible and pragmatic to trace the liabilities of transnational fossil fuel companies as direct complicit in the climate crisis, as those that have no incentive to change their practices, and as those that have built their wealth from unknowingly accrued ecological debt from extractivism. That relates to what Steph was saying in terms of who is benefiting from it. My first argument is that ecological debt has potential to strengthen and to drive counter-hegemonic agendas that put socio-ecological justice at the forefront of decarbonization strategies. Agendas where those responsible for the climate crisis assume a significant role in supporting pathways out of it, specifically by providing the financing the Global South requires to ensure their endogenous pathways to transformations, especially post-extractive transformations. I am particularly interested in the role fossil fuel companies as ecological debtors can play in supporting climate finance instruments created to fund these sustainability counter-hegemonic agendas, sustained on ecological debt claims as reparations and compensations. Climate finance instruments created with this purpose are not new. A precedent was set by Ecuador with the Yasuni ITT initiative. It did not only require compensation for avoided emissions, it created a trust fund administered by the UN, and by that it became the first proposal of a climate finance instrument specifically created to support the sustainability transition of a developing country, funded by ecological debtors. At that time, it was by individuals and nation states as ecological debtors. I argue that a similar scheme attributable to ecological debt and operationalized through existing methodologies for quantification of responsibility is justified and can be developed to demand fossil fuel corporations are taxed to finance the transformations of ecological creditors toward post-extractive futures. There are synergies to explore with other proposals that demand corporations are morally, but also legally responsible for supporting novel climate finance instruments, such as the Loss and Damage Fund, whose insufficient capitalization has actually presented itself as an opportunity. For instance, Stamp Out Poverty advanced a proposal and methodology to charge fossil fuel producers with a climate damage tax on each ton of coal, barrel of oil, or cubic liter of gas extracted. These funds, they propose, should be transferred to the Loss and Damage Fund as national contributions of the country where those taxes were collected. In the same vein, Lister envisions the establishment of a fossil fuel-funded climate disaster response fund, capitalized by taxing the top 200 fossil fuel companies. Marco Grasso, who we just heard from Zoom, is presenting today, also proposes a global climate reparations fund, and he advances a methodology to quantify the financial reparations owed by the top 21 fossil fuel companies. At supranational level, Bellinger draws on various precedents to justify and argue for an international agreement taxing excess fossil fuel profits. And at a national level in the US, of course, that was before Trump, there was political will to make fossil fuel companies accountable for climate change through the reintroduction on the 7th of February of this year of a Polluters Pay Climate Fund Act. To conclude, my argument presented today as a question for further research aims at supporting a counter-hegemonic agenda to current sustainability transitions, which are mostly focused on securing the net zero plans of the industrialized world, once again, through multiple ecological subsidies paid by the rest. Alternatively, I propose to envision pathways based on distributive and corrective justice, which operationalize ecological debt aspirations, not only by identifying those who are liable for the climate crisis. It is just to claim that those that have built their wealth, those that have benefited on fossil fuel and extractivism, must pay for their contribution to climate change. And it is also just to assign them the obligation to support the South-Sound pathways to transformations, which I claim are necessarily post-extractive. This should not only be a moral and a voluntary commitment, but an enforceable duty justified by their accumulated ecological debts. Thank you very much. I'm very looking forward to our discussion with the rest of the panel.